In our final video, we're going to be talking about the development of religious liberty in the early American Republic. So in order to get there, it's useful to see how various Christian ideals are informing religious thinking in this time period. There's two intellectual currents that we can think about here: Christian Republicanism and new developments in moral philosophy. And here I'm working through some material in Mark Noll's book, America's God, which I highly recommend to you for thinking through some of these dynamics. First, Christian Republicanism. First, we want to decouple any of our contemporary categories from these terms. So we're thinking about republicanism as it exists as a political concept in the 18th century. So let's remember what a republic is. A republic is a state in which supreme power rests with the people, i.e. not the monarch, i.e. not King George III. A republic then, or we can also say a commonwealth, those two words are equivalent, focus on the protection of the common goods of the people from corrupt power. So the notion is that the people are a collective. They hold certain goods in common. These can be principles like liberty or various guaranteed freedoms. It can also be the welfare and health of the state, the body politic, the republic itself, and trying to ensure that corrupt power doesn't infringe on these common goods. This essentially is what the United States Constitution and its political theory represents. Now, as Republican rhetoric develops in the American colonies in the middle of the 18th century towards its end, a couple of concepts begin to be deployed. One is virtue versus vice. There's goods that need to be defended in the Republic against certain collective vices that need to be resisted. Another polarity is liberty versus tyranny. The people ought to be guaranteed certain freedoms and be protected against tyranny or the abusive whims and dictates of the monarch. Another piece of this is the notion of the self-sacrifice of individuals, that people heroically give themselves for the cause of liberty, and this is contrasted against the abuses of monarchy, where the monarch, by their own whims and dictates, can amass things for themselves and not care about the needs of others. So republicanism emerges across early modern Europe as a way of critiquing monarchy. It's a new kind of political ideology. It's very strong in the American colonies. Also emerges very strongly in France. It has its proponents in England itself. In Haiti, there is its own kind of republican ideology in which a slave rebellion successfully overthrows and expels the French colonial powers. In colonial America, what begins to happen is that in order to think about and talk about republican ideals, they get couched within Christian discourse as well. So Christianity and republican ideals begin to be intertwined, or talking about republicanism in a Christian sort of register or tone or rhetoric makes republican ideals themselves more palatable. So whereas in France, republicanism distinguished itself heavily from Christian ideals, in the United States, the two are fused together. We see this also in the development of these new kinds of forms of moral philosophy that are really informed by Enlightenment thinking to a significant degree. So certain things we see in these patterns. One is an emphasis on common sense based on the capacity of all people to have common universal insights. So this sort of empiricism that we find in English Enlightenment thinking through a person like John Locke then gets moved into an appeal to common sense as a way to talk about freedoms and public virtues, and then as a way to critique older systems around tradition, around history, around state churches, around monarchy. So we see something like Thomas Paine's famous document, Common Sense, that helps aid the American Republican cause against the monarchy, is simply infused with this kind of reasoning and thinking. But an appeal to common sense also is a way that Christianity operates in the early American Republic. There is a rejection of state churches. They are disestablished because there's a common sense appeal that all people ought to have their own way of accessing worship of God that ought not be to be determined by official state structures that have been associated with the monarchy, for instance. So American Christian Republicanism, as a rhetorical form, intersects with this kind of new moral philosophy that's based on pragmatism and an appeal to common sense. And so part of what fuses here is a notion that public virtue can help support traditional morality. That is, the public virtue of Christian republicanism doesn't do away with good order. But what you don't appeal to is things like the monarchy as an organizing principle, nor do you appeal directly to things like Christian tradition or even biblical revelation itself. Rather, you have a form of operating this new way of talking about the common good of government that appeals to an undergirding Christian morality, but it's not based on revelation itself or specific church traditions, but rather this appeal to common sense, this appeal to universal human insight, with the assumption that Christianity, as figures like Locke and Kant had argued, represents the best kind of moral reasoning. So Christianity undergirds this business at the forefront of new public virtue. And so we could say that then we have a Christian country that is Christian morally, publicly, rhetorically, culturally, but not creedally, not officially. And this, I think, is still a dynamic we feel in American religious life today. So this takes us to the whole question of freedom of religion itself and the establishment of toleration of all religions in the American experiment. So American independence occurs in 1783, and there's a debate over what religious toleration ought to look like in the new republic. This is a debate that extends across the 1780s. It is formalized, it's resolved in 1789 with the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America. So let me read that to you. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So this is the core enshrinement of civil liberties, and freedom of religion is the same. But notice what it's actually saying. It's saying Congress shall not establish a religion or prohibit the free exercise thereof. So what it's saying is, no, the nation nor any state can privilege one religion over another. So in this context, it would be one form of Protestantism over another. But nor can it hinder the free exercise of any religion. That is, it can't prohibit Catholicism to operate. There's a famous question that the Jewish community of the Synagogue of Truro in Newport, Rhode Island has, where they write to George Washington after the First Amendment is passed, and they write to him and basically say, does this apply to us as well? Can we freely exercise our religion here? And George Washington famously writes back saying, yes. Now, this also doesn't mean that religious prejudice stops existing in the United States, and doesn't mean that there are still ways in which Christianity appears to be favored by state governments. And that gets worked out throughout the early decades of the 19th century, those questions. But this is a unique thing that begins to occur in the United States here around religious toleration. So there's some assumptions built in here, and we can review some of these assumptions from James Madison's work, Memorial Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, which is part of an effort in the 1780s to disestablish the colonial Anglican Church as the official church of the colony and then state of Virginia. So he makes a couple of arguments, right? One is religious affiliation based on personal choice is an inalienable right that Madison says is a duty to the Creator and has precedent to the claims of civil society. That is, no state has the capacity or right to limit how an individual relates to God. That is a radically new claim here in the 1780s. Moreover, he argues religion and government thus should be separate. Mingling the two inevitably leads to tyranny, and every person in the English-speaking world has as a reference point the English Civil War and the complaints against the Church of England as being excessively discriminatory against other religions, especially other Protestant denominations. So, if you make Christianity a state religion, Madison argues, that means you choose one kind of Christianity over others. So there's a kind of discrimination implicit in that then tramples individual freedom. So that's a form of tyranny, just as the monarchy could exercise forms of tyranny against individual liberties. And so, he argues that establishing any kind of religion is not necessary for civil government. So here, Madison is extending part of the arguments of the Act of Toleration from 1688 or 1689 back in England a century later and saying, okay, the logic of religious toleration is no church is established. So then the church, then the government never has to arbitrate about rights and privileges of one set of religionists over another. And so this disestablishment then would mean that this has two great benefits in Madison's thinking for the good of the Commonwealth, for the good of the Republic. So this is where we see Christian Republican thinking coming in. One is that this means all citizens are respected, as no one is discriminated against because of their religion. And hence, because there's toleration and religious pluralism across the spectrum, then if there's no prejudice or discrimination or benefiting of one group over the other, then grievances don't emerge, and thus cause for violence is avoided. Religious toleration leads to peace, is Madison's argument. So this really creates a great moment to pause here and think, what is it about America that's religiously unique here? I have this image for you here of a painting of by an artist from the middle of the 19th century, H.T. Matheson, who has this painting of the first prayer before the Continental Congress. So we have this whole notion of religious liberty, and then we have this prayer that's supposedly offered sometime in 1784, I think, which has Jacob Duché, who's the rector of Christ Church in Pennsylvania, offering a prayer at the opening of Congress. So what does it mean to have a chaplain at Congress, opening a prayer at Congress, and also having this new ideal of religious toleration being established? So is there actually a disestablishment of Christianity? Does Christianity still operate as a kind of national religion? Or is that simply a coincidence of other factors and dynamics? So I think it's a good question for us to consider as we enter into our conversations this week. All right, this is good. I'll talk to you later.